The city streets were quiet, wet from a late evening drizzle that left reflections of neon and streetlights shimmering on the asphalt. Emma Carter, a 23-year-old single mother, hurried along the sidewalk, her worn cleaning uniform clinging slightly to her in the damp air. She carried her small messenger bag tightly across her chest, a bundle of rags, cleaning supplies, and her personal items. Her thoughts were tangled between the rent due next week, Lily's school supplies, and the mounting bills she barely had enough to cover. 5 years had passed since her husband's sudden death, and she had learned to navigate life with a mixture of grit, exhaustion, and relentless hope. Tonight, like so many others, she was on a night shift for the office cleaning company she worked for. Her destination was a high-rise downtown, a building that housed one of the city's most prestigious companies, owned by the cold and disciplined CEO, Alexander Grant. Emma had worked here several months, cleaning offices long after the employees had left. She had learned to keep her head down, perform her duties silently, and avoid drawing attention, even as the imposing aura of the building and the man who owned it loomed over her in abstract form. As she entered the lobby, her boots squeaked lightly against the polished floors, and the familiar scent of antiseptic and fresh paper filled the air. The front desk was empty. The security cameras glowed softly, observing silently. She nodded to herself, a small reminder that the night's work would pass quickly if she stayed focused. Emma carried the bucket of supplies up the elevators, taking the stairs when the elevators slowed to a crawl under the weight of the tall building. Each step was a reminder of how far she had come, yet also of how heavy life's burdens could feel. When she reached Alexander Grant's office floor, the quiet hum of the building was punctuated only by the occasional distant car horn. Emma unlocked the office door, her movements practiced, smooth. The office was lavish yet austere, polished wood floors, glass walls that gave a panoramic view of the city, and subtle hints of luxury in every detail. Despite the richness of the space, Emma's focus was not on the opulence, but on the task: dusting, sanitizing, and leaving everything pristine for the CEO's return in the morning. Alexander Grant, the 28-year-old CEO, was known for his cold efficiency, rarely showing emotion, and often working late into the night. His office was a fortress of meticulous organization. Tonight, like so many nights, he was still there, papers spread in precise order, a laptop open, screens casting a faint glow across the room. Emma moved quietly, careful to avoid disturbing the papers, her hands steady and practiced. She reached into her pocket and felt the familiar weight of her locket, a small, worn piece of jewelry she always wore around her neck. Inside was a faded photograph of her late husband, a reminder of love lost and the sacrifices made. The locket was her anchor, a way to hold her past close while facing the challenges of each day. As she bent down to reach a spot behind the desk, the clasp of the locket loosened, and with a faint metallic click, it slipped from her fingers, tumbling to the floor. Emma froze for a moment, eyes widening. The sound of the locket hitting the polished wood echoed faintly through the room, and before she could even reach for it, the office door opened sharply. Alexander Grant entered, his presence commanding and immediate. He paused, his eyes narrowing, scanning the room, and then they landed on the locket, now lying open on the floor. The photograph inside caught the light, and for the briefest moment, his stoic expression faltered. "Where did you get this picture?" he asked, his voice low, measured, yet tinged with something that Emma couldn't immediately identify. Emma's hands hovered over the locket, heart pounding. It's my husband," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. He passed away when Lily was very young. I carry this as a memory." Alexander stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the photograph. There was a pause, a rare flicker of emotion crossing his usually impassive face. Emma could sense the tension, the curiosity, and the weight of something unspoken pressing in the air between them. She hadn't expected him to notice, let alone react in a way that would make her feel both nervous and strangely validated. The office was silent except for the distant hum of the city outside. Emma carefully picked up the locket and clasped it around her neck, unsure of what had just transpired. Alexander remained still, studying her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the routine of her night shift. For Emma, this moment marked the beginning of a journey that would intertwine their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted, an intricate story of kindness, memory, sacrifice, and the subtle stirrings of connection. She continued her cleaning, moving deliberately but with a heightened awareness of the man observing her, every motion noted, every gesture silently analyzed. The night stretched on, the quiet office filled only with the occasional sweep of her mop, the soft scrape of her dusting cloth, and the unspoken tension that now existed between a single mom and the billionaire whose life she had unknowingly touched. By the time Emma finished her shift, the first hints of dawn were visible on the horizon. The city was waking, yet inside that office, a seed had been planted, a spark of curiosity, recognition, and perhaps the slow beginnings of something more profound. Alexander Grant, the man who rarely showed emotion, had glimpsed a memory that carried the weight of love, sacrifice, and history. And Emma, unaware of the depth of the impact she had just made, walked out into the early morning light, her heart heavy yet inexplicably lighter, carrying not just her locket, but the invisible threads of a story that was only just beginning. The office was quiet after Emma finished cleaning the main floor. The polished surfaces gleamed under the dim overhead lights, reflecting the soft glow from the city outside. She had moved to the corner office, carefully wiping down the glass walls, when her hand brushed against her locket. A sudden click. The clasp had loosened during her shift, and the locket fell to the floor with a faint metallic sound. Emma bent down to pick it up, her fingers trembling slightly as the chain dangled in her hand. Alexander Grant, the CEO, had been sitting at his desk, buried in reports and numbers that demanded precision. He rarely noticed anything outside his work, yet the faint sound of the locket hitting the floor drew his gaze. His dark eyes lifted, scanning the office, and then they settled on the small object lying open on the polished wood. Emma hesitated, realizing the photo was now visible. She recognized the moment, the one picture she carried with her always, a memento of the man who had shaped her early life, her late husband's father, the one who had sacrificed everything for someone else's life. Inside the locket was a faded photograph of a young army officer, smiling confidently, unaware that his legacy would intertwine with lives he had never met. Alexander's breath caught. His expression, usually composed and unreadable, faltered. He rose from his chair, moving toward the locket with deliberate steps, each one measured but carrying an intensity that made Emma's heart beat faster. The office felt suddenly smaller, the air charged with something unspoken and powerful. "Where did you get this picture?" he asked, his voice low, precise, but laced with disbelief. Emma froze, clutching the locket to her chest. She had anticipated questions, curiosity even, but never the weight of recognition that seemed to hang between them now. Emma swallowed, her throat dry. It's my father," she said quietly. He passed away when I was little. I always carry this, to remember him." Her hands shook slightly, the emotional gravity of the moment pressing down on her. Alexander's eyes, sharp and analytical moments ago, softened imperceptibly. He studied the photograph, his mind racing back through fragments of memory he had buried deep, memories of his own brother, lost in a mission that had remained a secret for years. The resemblance, the timing, the circumstances, it all collided with the meticulous control he maintained over his life. Emma took a tentative step back, unsure of what this reaction meant. The office, once a space of sterile professionalism, had transformed into a chamber of revelations, of unspoken histories and hidden truths. She could feel Alexander's gaze on her, intense yet unreadable, a mixture of shock, recognition, and something far more complicated. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside and the soft click of the locket in her hand. Alexander's usual composure faltered again as he processed the significance of the photograph. The young army officer in the locket had died years ago, a hero whose sacrifice had remained largely unrecognized by the public, a truth only known to his family. And now, here was Emma, carrying his image with her, a tangible connection to a past that Alexander had never spoken of to anyone. He took a careful step closer, maintaining a formal posture yet unable to hide the flicker of emotion that passed through his dark eyes. This changes everything," he murmured, more to himself than to Emma. "I need to understand. Who is he to you? How did you come to have this?" Emma's pulse quickened. She had rehearsed explanations in her head countless times, yet now, standing in the presence of a man whose authority and reputation seemed unassailable, she felt exposed. She spoke carefully, truthfully. "He was my father. He died protecting someone he cared for, someone he didn't even know would remember him. I've always carried his memory with me, and this locket, it's the only piece of him I have." Alexander's gaze softened further, but it was tempered by the steel he carried within him. He nodded slowly, as though acknowledging the weight of her words, yet he remained silent for a moment, allowing the emotional gravity of the situation to settle over them both. The office seemed suspended in time, the polished floors reflecting not just the faint city lights, but the intensity of a connection that neither had anticipated. Emma placed the locket back around her neck, her fingers brushing the chain reflexively. She felt exposed, vulnerable, yet something about Alexander's presence was compelling, drawing her in despite her caution. The young billionaire, The man who had so often seemed cold and impenetrable now appeared human, touched by a truth he had kept hidden. "Emma," he said finally, his voice steady yet resonant with emotion, "this changes everything I thought I knew about that night, about the people involved, and perhaps even about you." She blinked, uncertain whether she had heard correctly, but she saw the subtle shift in his posture, the way his eyes lingered on her, a mixture of curiosity, respect, and something deeper that she couldn't yet name. The moment stretched, suspended between them, charged with unspoken recognition and the fragile beginnings of a connection that would soon evolve into something far more profound. The clock ticked silently, yet neither of them moved to break the intensity. Emma realized that this was more than a question about a photograph. It was the first step in unraveling a story intertwined with loss, heroism, and secrets that had long been buried. And as Alexander's gaze met hers again, she understood that the night she had cleaned his office would mark the beginning of a journey neither of them could have foreseen, a journey of revelations, justice, and perhaps even the slow bloom of trust and something more intimate. The office was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant city lights that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Emma stood still, her fingers tightening around the locket around her neck. Alexander Grant, the CEO, had just looked at the photograph inside, the young army officer smiling confidently, and for the first time in years, the composed billionaire's face showed a flicker of emotion. He took a deep breath, his jaw tense, and asked, his voice unusually soft, "Who is this man?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of recognition and unspoken history. Emma's heart pounded. She had expected curiosity, perhaps a polite inquiry, but the intensity in his gaze made her suddenly feel like the walls of the office had disappeared, leaving only the two of them in a charged space. "My father," she said finally, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. He died when I was little." She hesitated, then added softly, "He saved a life, someone very important." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, then softened, and for the first time, Emma noticed the subtle quiver in his usually sharp expression. His hands clenched briefly at the desk before he leaned forward, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "He saved my brother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's eyebrows furrowed slightly, the mention of a brother piquing her curiosity. Alexander took a moment to compose himself, his usual disciplined composure struggling against the flood of memories. "My older brother, he was on a secret humanitarian mission. There was a building about to collapse. No one else could have known or intervened in time. But your father, he sacrificed himself to save my brother's life." His voice broke slightly, the stoic veneer of the CEO giving way to genuine emotion. Emma gasped softly, her own eyes widening in recognition. That was him?" she whispered. "He never told anyone, just did what was right." "Yes," Alexander replied, his voice low and full of quiet reverence. "The world didn't know his name, only our family did. And now, looking at this photograph, seeing him again through your locket, I can finally acknowledge the magnitude of his bravery." The office was thick with silence, both of them absorbing the gravity of the revelation. Emma felt a warmth rise in her chest, not just for her father's courage, but for the undeniable trust that had formed between her and Alexander in this moment. She realized that this connection, forged through memory, sacrifice, and shared recognition of heroism, was far deeper than she had expected. Alexander stepped closer, his hands resting on the desk as he regarded her thoughtfully. "You carry him with you," he said, gesturing subtly toward the locket. "Every day, without fail. And in doing so, you've reminded me of what truly matters. Courage, integrity, sacrifice, all of it embodied in someone I would never have met if not for this moment." Emma swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to spill over. I just wanted to remember him," she said softly, "and somehow, carrying him with me makes me feel like I can face anything, any challenge, any struggle." Alexander nodded, his dark eyes glinting with a mixture of admiration and something unspoken, perhaps gratitude, perhaps something that went deeper, closer to the stirrings of trust and tentative attraction. "You've done more than that, Emma," he said quietly. "By simply carrying him, you've connected our lives in ways neither of us could have predicted, and I want to make sure his sacrifice is honored properly." Emma felt her chest tighten, not just from the weight of the revelation but from the undeniable intensity of his presence. The CEO, the man whose life seemed so distant and untouchable, was now entwined with hers in a way that felt both extraordinary and impossible. The room seemed suspended in time, the hum of the city outside fading into insignificance. Here, in this office where late nights and business empires collided with personal histories and forgotten sacrifices, A bridge had formed between two lives, built on courage, memory, and an act of kindness that had brought them together. Alexander finally took a step back, regaining a semblance of his usual composure. "We need to investigate this further," he said, his tone now calm but decisive. "There are questions that must be answered, truths that have been hidden far too long, and I intend to uncover every one of them." Emma nodded, sensing the gravity and purpose behind his words. She also understood that their lives had shifted irreversibly tonight, not merely through discovery or intrigue, but through the profound emotional connection forged by memory, sacrifice, and mutual respect. As Alexander returned to his desk to prepare, Emma carefully placed the locket back around her neck, feeling its weight not just as a memento of her father, but as a symbol of the unexpected intersection of lives, heroism, and the beginning of a story that would unfold far beyond this midnight encounter. The night hung heavily over the city, the skyline dotted with lights that shimmered through a thin layer of fog. Emma's heart still raced from the revelation in Alexander Grant's office, the connection between her father and the late humanitarian mission that had cost him his life. She had barely slept, replaying every detail, yet her mind was consumed by anticipation. What would come next? Alexander, usually composed and disciplined, was pacing in his office, reviewing documents and photographs. The locket's image had stirred memories he had long kept buried, memories of his older brother, the secret mission, and the sacrifice of Emma's father. He finally stopped, leaning over the desk, eyes narrowed in thought. There were pieces missing, gaps in the story that needed answers. He knew only one person might hold the key, the CFO of the company, a man trusted implicitly, yet hiding secrets that had remained buried for years. The investigation began subtly. Alexander requested all financial records, mission reports, and archives related to the secret operation. Each document he examined revealed more about the covert humanitarian mission, the critical moments when lives had hung in the balance, and the unacknowledged bravery of Emma's father. Every line, every entry, built a tapestry of courage, sacrifice, and deception. Meanwhile, the CFO, unaware that the CEO had begun piecing the puzzle together, continued his facade of professionalism, smiling in board meetings, issuing orders, and maintaining appearances. But small inconsistencies in his past actions, overlooked compensation reports, missing hero awards, and subtle gaps in financial allocations were now becoming threads that Alexander would follow relentlessly. Emma, unaware of the unfolding investigation, returned to her modest apartment after another night shift. Her thoughts wandered to Alexander, to the rare glimpses of vulnerability she had witnessed in him, and to the undeniable pull that seemed to tether her life to his. The locket around her neck felt heavier tonight, a reminder not only of her father's heroism, but also of the role she had inadvertently played in bringing truth to light. Days passed, and Alexander's inquiries intensified. He cross-referenced mission logs with employee reports, scrutinized every transaction, and traced anomalies that led directly to the CFO. It became increasingly clear that the trusted executive had misappropriated compensation funds and stolen credit for the heroism that had saved lives, including the life of Alexander's brother. Confrontations were inevitable. Alexander arranged a discreet meeting with the CFO, documents in hand, the weight of undeniable evidence pressing down. "You have kept secrets for far too long," Alexander began, his voice cold, precise, and unyielding. "The world deserves to know the truth. The families affected deserve justice, and I will ensure it is delivered." The CFO's face paled as he realized the depth of exposure awaiting him, his carefully constructed facade cracked, the arrogance and composure slipping away under the weight of truth. Every stolen award, every misallocated fund, every hidden report was now laid bare before the man he had deceived for years. As the confrontation unfolded, Emma entered the CEO's office, summoned by Alexander under the pretext of clarifying historical records. Her presence added another layer to the scene, the woman whose father had sacrificed his life, whose story had been obscured, and whose locket had ignited the chain of revelations. Seeing her, Alexander's gaze softened, and he gestured for her to observe the confrontation, not as a bystander, but as a witness to the justice finally being served. The CFO, trapped by evidence and the unwavering determination of Alexander, finally admitted to his misdeeds. Every deception, every act of greed and betrayal, was confessed under the weight of undeniable proof. The room, once a place of corporate formality, now became a theater of accountability, where courage and truth prevailed over manipulation and theft. Emma felt a swell of emotions, relief, validation, and a quiet pride. Her father's sacrifice, long ignored by the world, was finally acknowledged within the walls of the company that had unknowingly benefited from his heroism. Alexander, his usual stoicism tempered by the events, turned to her with a faint, approving smile. "Your father's legacy will not remain hidden," he said. "Not anymore." The night ended with a sense of closure and the quiet beginnings of something more profound between Emma and Alexander. Trust had been established, justice delivered, and the path laid for a connection that neither of them had anticipated but now could not ignore. The city outside continued to hum, oblivious to the drama, heroism, and emotional resonance that had played out within the towering glass walls of the CEO's office. The boardroom was tense, the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Alexander Grant, CEO of the billion-dollar company, stood at the head of the table, documents laid out meticulously in front of him. The CFO, whose trusted position had masked years of deceit, sat uncomfortably in the center, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The room was silent except for the subtle shuffle of papers as Alexander began. "Today," Alexander's voice cut through the tension, precise and commanding, "we reveal the truth. For years, lies have masked the sacrifices of those who acted with courage and integrity. One man, a hero, has remained unrecognized. His family has been denied the justice he deserved." He gestured to Emma, standing quietly near the side of the room. "This woman carries the memory of her father," he continued, lifting the locket she always wore, now resting gently in her hand. "A man who saved my brother's life during a secret humanitarian mission. He gave everything, and yet the credit, the recognition, the compensation, was stolen." The CFO's face paled. Alexander laid out the evidence, financial records, mission logs, and documents proving the misappropriation of awards and compensation. Every act of deceit was now undeniable. The room was heavy with the weight of truth. Emma's eyes welled up as the reality of her father's heroism was formally acknowledged. She had carried this secret for years, the quiet pride and grief of his sacrifice entwined with her every action. Now, standing in the very office she had cleaned countless nights, justice was finally visible. The CFO could no longer hide. Alexander addressed the board decisively. "This man has betrayed the trust of the company, of the families involved, and of the very mission meant to save lives. Effective immediately, he is removed from his position and legal action is underway." A soft murmur of approval rippled through the room. Emma felt a deep sense of relief, the long shadow over her family finally lifting. Alexander stepped forward, offering a small, respectful smile. "Emma, your father's courage will no longer be forgotten, and your life, and your daughter's, will be supported in a way he would have wanted." Months later, a charitable foundation was established in her father's name, dedicated to supporting single parents and families of cleaning staff with education and housing assistance. Emma stood beside Alexander at the opening ceremony, the crowd buzzing with excitement and hope. Lily clutched her mother's hand, eyes wide with wonder at the event honoring her grandfather's legacy. Alexander leaned slightly closer, his voice soft, carrying a warmth Emma had only glimpsed in rare moments. "I thought your locket carried a photograph," he said, "but it carried the truth that changed my life." Emma smiled, her heart full. "Sometimes the smallest memories open the biggest doors," she replied, her voice steady and rich with emotion. They looked at each other, a subtle connection sparking between them, not rushed, not forced, but undeniable. The heroism, the justice, and the recognition had been achieved, and amidst it all, a quiet, tender romance began to bloom. The screen would fade to black, leaving the story complete. Heroic sacrifice, honored, justice served, and a bond formed between two lives once separated by chance, now intertwined by courage, memory, and mutual respect.